Hi everyone, this is Dr. Alana James. Today is the final episode in a three-part investigation of storytelling science with David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile. It's been my privilege to work with these two exciting professionals, and there have been a lot of artifacts created. So this last webinar will be one of them. But I'm going to go very fast through the slides today. And then because there is a video that they did, which really looks in depth at a number of these issues. And as you know, if you've heard David talk and the rest of them, when he gets started, he draws in everything that comes into his mind. And so the video is 45 minutes. That means we're going to run over. And if you have to leave today, I understand. Go ahead. The recording will be available to you as well. And everybody who is watching by recording, thank you very much for your interest. So let me just get started. www.wooclap.com/story science is our archive of the brainstorm we have on the process, the philosophy, and the questions. So thanks to everyone who's contributed to that and therefore contributed to the whole series as David answered your questions. Short recap. What is storytelling science? Dr. Boje calls it the fourth wave of grounded theory. Others have called it an innovative advance on narrative inquiry. He made comments in our many hours of tape that it was also had a style of ethnographic research that includes the researcher and her intuition in the mix. So we can say that storytelling science situates itself in the heart of some of the very best types of methodology, and actually I think takes it further. Why is it important? Well, because it uses our humanity as researchers to get past the discussion of bias. It requires us to look for divergent information that refutes our claim. That's intersubjectivity analysis. It gives us a framework, they call it anti-narrative, that helps us investigate the context so that our findings can take root in the past and the future as well. And he'll explain that in much more depth when we get to the video. And for those who like stories as just a way of understanding things, which is probably most of us, these ideas take us further. And if any of you are interested in studying indigenous populations, we will have a section that will talk about that as well. So it's really very much at the forefront of taking qualitative research to the next level. So David and Grace Ann talked and then had earlier sent me this slide. So let me just talk about it. David talks about there's two ways of knowing. The Western way of knowing was narrative. We did interviews. It evolved into narrative and counter-narrative talks. It's very mental. And if you were to track it to grounded theory, you'd say it's what he calls the second and the third wave of grounded theory that were put forth by Glasser. Or, no, sorry, the other partner. The first wave of grounded theory, Glasser's and David's work, he puts under the indigenous ways of knowing. So I think that's a very important place to start. Western science says we need to measure it. We can measure it. Our minds can figure it out. And we use induction and we use statistics and we talk in business that way. So that's what he puts under Western. Indigenous way of knowing opens up our humanity to be organically attached to the planet. Our indigenous way of knowing looks at the totality before it looks at the parts. Western way of knowing takes it the other direction. And so he would put these things in this order. And these slides I will put up when the video starts. I'll go ahead and put these slides up for you in the handout, so they'll be there. We were asked in the WooClap brainstorming, a couple of people said that they wanted me to go over his philosophical background. So I have the slides here. I'll just say them quickly. Mikhail Bakhtin, and what he got from them was the idea that every point of view has its own language. And he told the story about he's building a greenhouse, and he had to learn the language of science, and he had to learn the language of botany, and he had to learn the language of these other things. I think it's a good story, and we can all look in our own lives for how we've gone into something, and as we've explored it, we've had to learn other languages, central languages or sometimes decentral. So Bakhtin discussed that, and he recommends him as a basis for storytelling science. The other basis is the philosopher Walter Benjamin, who wrote an essay on a storyteller. And the important thing David took from that was that that storytelling is changing as our world changes and becomes more mechanistic. That there used to be groups of people like miners, and they all told a similar story, and the whole group built a way of living. And now we are what he calls the story of the personality, the politics of the personality, and that will endemically change our roles as qualitative researchers, because if our goal is to study the lived experience, and if every person has their own very divergent lived experience, then of course our job becomes much harder. This particular way of doing research relies heavily on the self-correcting ideas in Charles Sanders Peirce. And Charles Sanders Peirce talked about science as a self-correcting process, and he used abduction, induction, and deduction. I'll cover that more in just a minute when it gets to how Boje and Rosile are using it. Karl Popper, basically his major story sets on the idea that that science is self-correcting, and that we have to go look for those parts that completely disagree with us. And that if we do that, then what we do shines, and that the theories that survive that refutation process are the ones that we need to listen to. And he told this story about Sir Eccles, who went to a Karl Popper lecture, as a result developed a test to refute his own theory, and won the Nobel Prize as a result. And then finally, and I would say most qualitative researchers that I know have at some point relied on Martin Heidegger. The background in this case is that for David's work, it's the background for the anti-narrative theory, which again will be discussed in more depth by him. And I have a few slides when it comes to how we collect these data. And specifically the force structuring part, which is an ontological discussion. But again, you have all those slides. He is a proponent of cooperation, unity, organization, and cultural synthesis. He would look to see those things in any qualitative product. So that's the philosophy. I thought since most of the people that we talk to are students, we might want to break this down into the collection process. So he has the AID model, and you can see this is coming from Pierce, adduction, induction, and deduction. He first described it to me as adduction was what you thought was going to happen. It's the looking backwards part. Induction as what actually happened when you did the research, and deduction as looking forward. And you'll see the importance of that when we get into more in his theory and what he has to say about it. But this particular component, I think, I'm an action researcher, and this particular component, because it adds the what you thought was going to happen, resonates very well with any of the iterative sciences. So this is a series of slides that was given to him by a student or someone he knew in another part of the world, and it shows you this system that you go through. It's useful when we're starting out to know that we're on a path and that we know what the next step is. So the first part of the path is to look backwards and to look at what your topic is and what you think is going to happen, and you write that down. You frame it in time and place, and you try to make sense of it based on personal experience. Your second step is to go out and talk to some people. And he talks about you have conversation with them. And the point of having a conversation is that you have to be there too. This is not an ask questions and you sit back and take the answers. This is a dialogue between you. And because of that, it will have its own roots and it'll go different places. And then you do a comparison of that to what you thought was going to happen, and you reflect. Then at that point, you go out and you look for somebody who had a really different point of view about what you're talking about. So you can see your story is growing. You had your story. This is what you thought it was going to be. You let in somebody else. You had a really good interactive moment, and the story grew. And now you're looking for the other side of the story, people who are going to disagree with what you think you know right now. Then you go back to just more dialogue with people, more gathering of information, and again, you go look for evidence that refutes what you have heard so far. Now, obviously, depending on the size of your story, depending on what you're going after, this can go on and on and on in a spiral process. But notice the symbol in the middle of these. That is a symbol of two people coming together in their own spiral, which is that good, juicy conversation that takes us into deeper levels of understanding. And David would say deeper levels of story. Anti-narrative intersubjectivity. So it depends on different people is really, you're looking for the untold story. And the picture here is, of course, these two people, the devil, the boss and her assistant, have very different stories about that coat. All right, so you've gone off, you've identified this, you've really pushed yourself to get the other side going. You have a lot of information and you think you know what you're about. You think you have an argument of something you want to say as a result of your work. Great. Now, what are the things that you need to, the boxes that you need to click in order to really do a good job of it as storytelling science? Well, then this takes us into this, and I won't go into it much, but the anti-narrating is a place in the middle where you look at the past, you rehistory the past because you've learned some things. So now you can go back to your idea about the past and it's different. And you can look, your idea about the future has changed. The Western way of knowing is you can abstract the problem differently, and the indigenous way of knowing is that hopefully you've absorbed enough of it that you're grounded. So he would use this as an icon of where you need to be in order to write up. He takes that further and he builds out the anti-narrative into a theory. So if you're going to do this work, then I would say in the simplest form, you want to be able to tell this story. You want to talk about what happened before. You want to talk about the abstract stuff that goes on, and he calls it beneath, but he puts it up at the top. So that's the lit review. That's the other things that you've done that, and what people have told you on an intellectual level. What you thought about the future, what actually happened or you see coming, and then the deep underlying understanding that you have now that you didn't have before, and then back into the beyond notice goes back into the rehistorizing. And again, he'll do a better job of talking about it. But when I first saw this one, I thought, okay, if I'm writing up something as storytelling science, I'm going to want to have those as my headings, and I'm going to want to talk about the anti-narrative dialogue through the different parts of his theory. Earlier on, some questions were asked. I just want to make sure that you have this. What are the 3 things that are most important when bringing data together to tell a story? Let people speak in their own voices. It's their story, their data, not yours. Explain the context, and that's the B's of the anti-narrative that we just looked at. Identify patterns in both the process and the content. And that's what other qualitative sources call themes. They're similar. So you're looking throughout your qualitative data, you're looking for things that form a pattern, show up in the process, how you put them together in those 6 B's. And then someone asked, how does the storyline relate to publication? And he said there were 2 elements. If you're going to write this up, you need 2 elements for sure. You need to have done your reflexive work, self-reflection, he called it, on how you influence the process. Other people call it reflection with an X, and autoethnography. And he called it, he said at one point that it was really crying. It was really when you're doing the deep search into what is your view of the world and how has it changed as a result of this work you've done. And self-reflection with self as subject, how the topic has changed you. So those 2 go together. Publications, so he wants to see that. He wants to know about you as well as the story that you're telling because of what other people said. That builds a whole story. And of course, you'll have to write to the format of the particular journal. So where you start, and the parts that are bold and italicized are my words. He said you start when something captures your attention, and he calls that abduction. I would go on to say that that's where you develop your ideas and think about how it will work out. That's your history part. Then you wonder how to test it. That's what he calls induction. You test it, things happen, you note them down, you reflect upon them, and you reflect about your part in them. And then so it's important that you do your data analysis as you go along. This is not a system where you get it all done and then you look back. And then you develop a theory of conclusions from the premises, which is what he calls deduction, where you're deducing what else might happen and who else might disagree. And it may be iterative, and you may go through a couple of cycles of that, depending on when you can cut it off and say, that's it, I know what I need to know here. He drew it out like this. I won't go into it in depth because of time today, but you can see you go forward, you go backwards, you go forward, you go backwards. And these slides will be available to you. So this is where we start the video that I'm about to show. Once again, thanks to everyone who's come on. I'll start the video, I'll turn off my mic, and then I will put up the slides in the handouts as we go. So welcome again, and Here we're off. Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Alana again. And what's happened in the meantime was that I sent last week's process statements and questions on to David and Grace Ann, and they're very nicely have decided to come back to us and have conversation about what we were thinking, etc. So welcome, David Boje and Grace Ann Rosile. What else have we got here?
Well, here we've tied it into a simplified chart, I hope. It's me, so what do you want? It's got kind of a horizontal, there's many futures and many pasts, so we're constantly futuring, this project, another project, and we're co-creating with others that have their own futuring going on. At the same time, as we're doing that, we're pulling out different parts of history. We're rehistoricizing to support those projects in the future. So there's a loop there of futuring and rehistoricizing. And then by grounding and abstracting Western ways of knowing, and this is where Grace Ann's book is so marvelous, right? We should get the, do you have the book here? Let's just show it. There. I'm going to get the book and show you because she never does this. I'll get it. Oh, she's going to get it. So. All right. This is a very special book. This is Tribal Wisdom for Business Ethics. And in this book, she talks about the difference between storytelling done by indigenous, tribal wisdom, and storytelling done by Western approach. And Western narrative is very much about abstracting concepts, about moving things up to a very universal, generalizable level, very abstract, where grounding in indigenous ways of knowing, right? We call it IWOC, indigenous ways of knowing. Grounding in community, you're grounding in nature, right? It's very much entanglement with nature and community. So you're very embedded there. So that's what we mean by grounding. With Western ways of knowing, we call it waywalk, Western ways of knowing, you're kind of moving up very much about concepts, about theories, about abstractions. And that's where I moved the beneath up there, because that foreconception, that's the conceiving before the event. That's very prominent. Where in grounding, the two kinds of anti-narrative processes are the foregrasping, sensing the context, but am I sensing it with my eyes and ears and nose? No, there's this whole intuitive thing going on. And then for structuring, you really got to know the ground to understand how things are moving and interacting in the ground. And then with the future, we got the bets and becoming and the history, the before. Those four concepts are all from Martin Heidegger's work, and it's existential work. If you're going to study that, be prepared for months of work, and get somebody that really knows German so you can really share the true meaning of some of these sentences in the German form, not just the English form. Anyway, so we've done that work with really wonderful German lady that lives here in Las Cruces, and she's gone to all my classes, and we'll trot out the Heidegger and say, now we're going to look at foresight. What is it? What's the word in German? How does it work? What's the nuances of but this is just an overview. I hope it's somewhat clear.
So I have a question. I have a couple of, because you brought up Grace Ann's work, and one of the people who I've had a conversation with since then, his research is, in fact, he may get in touch with you directly, but his research has to do with he has 30 years experience with tribes, Native American tribes, and the social welfare system, taking children out of their homes, stuff.
Oh.
Yeah. And so now, as a mature person, he wants to look at the tribes. Look, they did a report of all the things that had gone on in this, and the tribes had questions about, well, how do other parts of the country, how do other social welfare agencies who are working with other tribes, what have they done, and how has that worked? So that's the essence of his research. And he has 2 Native people on his committee.
Mm.
So he's doing what appears from the outside, at least, to be a very good job of walking into wanting to do this in an I walk way instead of a W walk way. Way walk way. So, Grace Ann, what hints would you say? What comes to your mind talking to a person in that circumstance?
It's going to be difficult because it's difficult to get IRB permission to go inside tribes. You have to have the tribal permission as well as your institutional permission. And I was just on a committee this past week where a Native woman gave up on her original design because it took too long.
Yeah.
And she couldn't get permission. And so we've seen this a lot. So I would have a plan B. Ideally you would want to talk to maybe some of the people who went through the system and what is their story and their experience so that you get those actual stories, not just the stories of the people in the agencies. But you might have to stick with the agencies because of getting permissions.
He might be able to get permission from the 2 tribe members on his committee and work it that way, and they may be able to help him with the other permissions. But you got to really, the scope of the project really has to be about working with the tribal councils and getting the permissions if you're going to do something comparative.
Interesting.
But ideally, you want the stories of people who went through the system, not just the administrators of that system.
Yeah.
But that might not be feasible. You might not have that many years to work on it.
Right. Although he's pretty relaxed about that part.
Good.
So, okay. Thank you for that. Let's see what else you've got here.
Okay, here is just a little bit more formal definition. So when we deal with the foreconception, the beneath, language, symbols, concepts, these are all pre-constitutive of narrative and story. And I use the word narrative as Western narrative and story in the tribal sense of living story. So we'll talk more about that if you like. The bets on the future is foresight. So can you see out there what's happening? That's called prospective sense making in Western jargon, but it's pre-constitutive of narrative and story. And then the becoming is the ethical, the forecaring, pre-constituting in space-time mattering. Again, ontologically, what are you doing? What's your part in this? How are you forecaring? How are they forecaring? What's the institution forecaring for what's happening? For example, we're in COVID-19. Are we getting the test kits out? Are we getting the, are people getting those ventilators? Are their medical people really cared for? People at McDonald's restaurants, are they getting the masks? Are we providing them the health? So forecaring turns out to be a huge area. Forestructuring is good for the engineers. What's the infrastructure going on here? How do we anticipate this? You get a baby in the home, you better be putting little guards over the plug so the baby doesn't put their fingers in there. You better have your crib with a narrow rail so the baby's head doesn't get in there. You got to have colors so the child grows up inquisitive, not a bland, so the infrastructure. For grasping, we've already talked about intuitive grasping, an emotive sensing, a pre-articulation. So often you working with people in the field and they don't know how to articulate the story or narrative. Nobody's ever asked them that part. Or maybe they've done it a million times, but let's say they haven't. Well, you're in a zone where you're going to be helping the story along, and they're going to be very much about trust with you. Can I trust to tell you something I've never told anybody in my life? I didn't tell my mom and dad. Why am I going to tell you? You know, so this foregrasping is real important, but also for strategy work. You're trying to foregrasp where you're going in the future. The before is obviously the history, pre-constitutive of coherence and narrative, but what people don't understand is the futuring wraps around, and we're picking out points of history to justify our direction in the future. So that a little bit more grounding in the anti-narrative world.
I see these last two slides as good things to have up when I'm beginning to write and I'm putting together my argument and my thoughts and how I want it to go. And then I'm making sure that I've covered these things and I'm figuring out where they belong in the scientific organization of background lit methodology, results and findings. Do you see people who are writing that, put them in different places on the story?
Now you're starting to see articles where people are using these concepts. You know, the 2001, we only had bets and before, but, you know, after 2008 and 14 and now, they're starting to use all six. And so you'll see when they present their findings, they'll have a section on foreconception, on bets in the future, becoming, you know, the beyond is just coming on board, and now they're starting to use that as well.
And so are they putting them in as headings?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So just to give people how to use them. All right. This actually changed my last poster. So I love this. Go for it.
All right. Sure. You want to do it, Grace? Okay. So this is in a couple of books that are coming out and slides all over the internet. If you just look for this. Basically comes out of Charles Saunders Peirce's work in the 20s and 30s. And I was really excited when I found reference to the whole idea of self-correcting in Peirce's work. And then I was reading a colleague in Europe, and he said, well, Peirce mentions it a couple of times, but never did it. I said, wow, what a great opportunity. So I got all of Peirce's volumes and I read them front to back, everything. And I found half a dozen examples of where he used the term self-correcting. And he's using it in conjunction with inductions. You know, that you do the inquiry. That's your induction. You're doing your inquiry. And he said, you know, you have a crude induction where you don't quite know what's going on. So it's crude. You know, it's kind of like first wave grounded theory. You know, it's crude, but it's fun to do. And then you have qualitative induction where you're really trying to pin down, like in second and third wave, the concepts and how they're used. And, you know, it's more carefully controlled. But he said you also have quantitative induction where these are used interdependently, the qualitative and quantitative, not divorced from each other as we're used to seeing them in the classroom, but how do they integrate together? So, and we'll talk more about that. So the induction is what you're doing in the research. That's how you're going in the field and you're doing your inquiry. But you also have abduction, where those little flashes of insight pre-constitutive of a hypothesis or proposition, but even before there's just like, whoa, here's a flash of insight I'm having during the conversation with somebody. What do I do with that? You know? And so what we've said is it's the AID, the abduction, induction, deduction, these are interactive. So in the midst of your inductions, you're having abductions, you're deducing, you're doing all three processes at once. You're also, in the scale of your dissertation, the timeline, you're doing them in the beginning, you're changing your abductions as you go through, you're changing the theory wave by wave, you're changing your induction strategies, you're trying this, you're trying that, you're doing this experiment, this interview, this conversation, this reading of a science article. So what we've asked students to do, and faculty, you know, everywhere, is start tracking and annotating and diarying, journaling step by step each moment of the abductive event, each moment of induction test, each moment of deduction as you go through. So people aren't used to doing that. They're trained in the survey science world, and they're used to just, well, let's just do everything and distribute our surveys, and then we'll gather all the data, we'll put it all together, clean the data, throw out all the stuff that really doesn't work, clean the data, and then we'll interpret it. Well, you can't do that in qualitative research. You're going to end up with junk. You have to like carefully record your abductions, inductions, deductions as you go. And that's a really hard lesson for people to learn. I can't tell you how many dissertations come to me. Somebody will come to me and say, well, I've done 65 interviews and now I've got them transcribed. So I hired a service, they transcribed it. Now I got, 850 pages here. What should I do? I said, well, why don't you just start over? Because you're never going to figure this out. You know what I mean? It's kind of like saying, I throw these ingredients together and I bake this cake and now I want to produce a recipe. Well, good luck with that.
That's good. So because I come from an action research background, and action research sees all of this as an ongoing process in a circle. Mm-hmm. What captured me about your AID was what I thought was going to happen, what happened when I got there, and I did some research, and then what I thought about that in the future, what I think I'm going to take to that, to go back to what I think is going to happen next, to what I do in the research. So to me, there's a marriage between this and what is in action research: planning, measuring, acting, and reflecting. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah, sure. We grew up in that. So absolutely.
Yeah. It's
okay. So then
your process, it just gets all mixed together.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who go, oh, no, I can't do that, then think of it as a spiral and just spread that process a little bit and you'll get to the same place. But you'll be doing it as you go. You'll be doing all the bits as you go. You won't come up with 165 pages of transcripts and then go, well, what happened?
Yeah, because a good ethnographer is taught, and I used to teach ethnography at UCLA and everywhere else I've been since, is, you learn to document as you go, to take time and journal your diary, not just, oh, here's my main concept and what's happening, and 18 people are going to cite this in my lifetime. What are you doing? So it takes a lot of self-reflexivity, and we'll get to that.
Okay. Okay. So here's the next.
Well, this is the title of the book. It's not by World Scientific anymore. It's
not called that.
And it's not called that. We'll just take that.
So we'll just take that slide out. Okay.
How to do conversational storytelling.
Edward Elger Publishing is doing it. And
how to do conversational storytelling.
But if you search on that other one, you can find the original documents before Grace Ann edited them.
Okay, so what do we got here?
This was done by one of our students, Vanderkleid, whose dissertation I didn't put up there yet, by the way, in that other slide. I'll try to find it. And he went to one of our seminars with Maori students in New Zealand at Christchurch. and talking to him, we were talking about Thomas Kuhn and paradigms and all that. And I said, it'd be really nice to have a good illustration like puzzle pieces. And so the next day he came and he brought this, and I thought, well, this is a really good teaching tool. And he says, propose an abductive hypothesis to explain a problem. And that's kind of like your little puzzle piece in paradigm work. Go to the next slide. And then you're going to start doing inductive tests. You might do an experiment, you might do an interview, you might do pulling up a science article from another discipline. So you start to do your inquiry. So you're playing with that puzzle piece, and you're starting to generate theory. You're starting to have deductions, So that's happening. Go ahead. And you're testing to see if that theory can be falsified. Like this is big for Karl Popper fans and for Charles Saunders Peirce. You're always trying to refute your own theory as you go. And that's what that's the big learning lesson in conversational storytelling. Is you can do that right in the storytelling conversation. You don't have to I'm going to wait a week and come back. And then, no, you can start to tease it out right there in the session and when you come back too. So you're trying to falsify as you go. Go ahead. But you got an anomaly here. It doesn't work. It doesn't quite fit. And what Grace Ann said, it's all about context. So you're looking at the whole context and you're going well, it sort of works, but it doesn't quite do it, So what am I going to do? So you're going to have to adjust your theory as you move along in your dissertation work. So ad hoc addition to avoid the theory being refuted. So you're making an ad hoc addition. Now, this is where Karl Popper was really concerned. He doesn't like ad hocery, and this is where he wants you to be recording as you go. I'm finding this anomaly, and this is what I'm going to do about it. Not, I had an interview. Now I'm going to do a fix to my theory.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The things you don't tell the committee, that you ended up with this piece and it had a bump, but you don't tell them it didn't used to have a bump. You just go forward like you saw it having a bump all along. Yeah,
that's part of the deceit in a dissertation, that we try to avoid. And that's where, the self-reflexivity ethics is really a better partner in your dissertation.
Yeah.
These are just quotes from Charles Saunders Peirce, just so you know. So the 2 indicates these are all from volume 2, and they're from the section 266 to 24, etc. Sometimes they're repeated in a couple different sections. So deduction belongs to a general class of results of theory argument that in the long run tend towards the truth of case results. So he has kind of a truth idea that you're getting closer to the truth. You don't know it yet. You got part of it. You still got some anomalies. You're working it out. And that's the story of a dissertation, I think. Induction, you're working on generalizing from a number of cases. And this is where most dissertations are problematic because they're not being very careful about how they're drawing the cases that are being used. Actually, you would want random sampling, right? Stratified random. That rarely happens. It's mostly opportunity sampling.
Yeah.
Convenience sampling. But what you can do is and we'll show you an example of this, get some interviewees on topic, get some that you think are going to be counter to what your thesis is in little ways. Not going to be obnoxious unless you want that, but you're going to take it a little different direction because they have a different expertise, different gender, different ethnicity, whatever it is. And then your abductions assume it was a case of a general rule results that will need actual inquiry. So that just means you have a guess, but without doing the induction, you don't know.
So you do your own refutation by seeking.
That's our puppy. The mailman just showed up.
Yeah.
That's my abduction.
Yeah.
So the immediate present has just joined us, and the living
Yes.
story of being with our puppies.
Yeah.
And then we have induction, which is for the thirdness, these different kinds of qualitative inquiry. They're also bets on the future, you know. And you have the deduction, the otherness of the past theories already there, retrospective, narrative sense making, that sort of thing. I'm just trying to put these
You're
AID
doing a good job. You're layering. So if somebody needs to do this and needs to write it up, and they need to see, they can go through your slides carefully and say, okay, this is really the one I'm going to center on and use. But you're showing them how they layer, which is really good, because they get to committee, and that committee's got some other background, and they're going to need to be able to layer. I mean, this is actually, layers like this are the heart of academic speech. Is the ability to do that. Drives me crazy. Okay.
This is an example from New Zealand. I was there. They invited me down for a month. Really good opportunity if we ever get to traveling again.
Which Mark's again?
Mark Vanderklight. And he came up with this after the second day. He's just really good at graphics and having clear illustrations without a lot of buzzwords hanging around. So I said, okay, let me try this. And we'll go through it step by step in a second. But the AHA, AHAU, is a Maori term for being self-reflexivity. So starting your dissertation in a self-reflexive meditative posture, you know, what am I doing? What am I about? Write it down, you know. So many dissertations, they go in the field and then they say, oh, okay, and it's what they said and what she said and what, no, it's what you were reflecting upon. Now in Maori culture, you don't go do interviews with somebody. You bring your story to the first interview. So if you see the spiral, the 2 and the 1, he took his story and there were 2 participants in the first interview. But then he did a counter story interview with 1 participant. So he did 2 that would be on topic for his information technology study, you know. And he did 1 that he thought, well, this person's going to disagree with what those 2 said. So he's trying to do refuting and falsification as he goes through the process. Really splendid design. I've hardly ever seen this worked out in methodology. But second visit, 3 people came to the interview, and they had a storytelling conversation. That means he shared his story. They shared back. He shared counter story. They shared, somebody else shared. They shared with each other. So they're doing co-inquiry. It's a self-organizing event, you know. And then 1 + 1, as a counter person showed up in another interview, but then a second counter person. So he uses the 1 + 1 to indicate somebody joined in, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Next time he did a bigger event with 4 people and a storytelling conversation. They're sharing back and forth. He's in the middle of it. And then he did a counter, and he ends up with 3 more, and a counter where somebody joined the counter story event.
So this is his model, his diagram of to explain to his reader his process.
Correct.
What the process was like. It's a good.
And it's always about spiral.
And yeah, and good design too. This is another way of looking at that.
Yeah, this is more of what work Grace Ann and I have done, working with the community. I'm going to let Grace Ann talk about it. Go for it.
I
with
don't
CIW. Okay.
Well,
please, Grace Ann, would you help us?
Are we getting through the questions?
Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay. So an example of how you go through the process of self-correcting, we used with our coalition of Immokalee workers, the South Florida agricultural workers that we studied. We went there to study how their motto of "We are all leaders," and we wanted to see their how they practiced leadership. So we, what's it say on the first one?
Test by
ethnographic AID assumptions by critical self-reflection.
So we did our background research. We looked up internet articles. We looked at their own publications, and we wanted to go talk with them and see how this actually plays out. And our idea was that it was this leadership, study, basically, the ensemble, see how they practice what we called ensemble leadership. And they didn't call anything in particular. They just said we're all leaders. So we did observe them in one of their demonstrations. And we got a lot of information on how they involved everyone in decisions. It was not that the traditional management has sometimes been described as head versus hands. So the management is the head and the workers are the hands. And we saw the total opposite of that with the CIW, where they put on a skit, and all of the actors in the skit also carted pieces of the set onto the stage, also swept the floor, did things like, they did everything. Everyone pretty much did everything. And then in the skit itself, they invited the audience to comment, to come up on stage. So it was this very involving, inclusive process. So then we got permission to actually go and visit their headquarters and talk to them. So an interesting aspect of doing qualitative research was that we found out afterwards, somebody said, "Oh, you actually got it." They're a little bit protective of their processes. And so looking back on it, we realized them inviting us to observe their demonstration without getting in the way, we had to promise not to get in the way, was a little bit of a test to see who we were, what story, and how are we going to be in relation to them. And I guess we passed, and they said, "Sure, come on down." But the interesting thing was that even though they said that first day I got there first, so I had more time and spent a week there, they had a staff meeting, and I said, "Oh, good, can I observe your staff meeting?" She said no. So some things we still didn't get to observe, but the point was they had to know us better, and we had to observe and respect their processes. So in that second phase, what we discovered was it's not so much about leadership, and it is participative leadership, but what we saw was there were what we called ensemble storytelling, ways that they allowed everybody to participate in bringing their story together in the group. And so our research shifted. So when we look at the self-correctingness, this is what we found in that example, that what we had to shift to was their ways of allowing people to participate in telling and creating a communal story and bringing everything together. And so, yes, it's leadership, but it's the way that they did this inclusive process.
Yeah. What turns the Western view of leadership on its head. So this went through several phases. Is this your diagram of that, or did
it is? It's in our book, and it's just an illustration. The tests won't occur in that order necessarily. We just wanted to show where we were doing more autoethnographic. Of course, all the way through, And then when storytelling conversation came in phase 2, and then we had to check the available science. We're dealing with things like the chemical composition of fertilizer and pollution and how it creates birth defects in migrant farm workers. So there's technical things we need to explore the science. And then last, one of our doctoral students and co-authors on the piece, and you can find this in the Business and Society current issue, and also a few years ago we did the theory from phase 1 in the Leadership Journal it's called Ensemble Leadership Theory. Anyway, so it's produced 2 journal articles and self-correcting inductive research.
Okay, back here. Yeah.
So that's it. We'll go through Vanderkleit's slide here. So this is the name of the praxis.
Okay, so this is, okay.
Or, conversational sharing back and forth. So it's not a Western concept, although everybody gets in conversations in families, etc. But there's something a little different about the back and forth.
Let me give an example of some of this. We asked the question with the CIW in Florida. We said, well, how do you motivate people? And Lucas said, we don't motivate, we animate. And he was clear about. So motivation is a top-down kind of what you do to them. But animation is allowing people to be agents.
And be embodied. There's something really different about it.
In themselves. Yeah. So that was a self-correcting there that we did.
Yeah, very good. So this just goes through the cycle again of analytical comparison. You're doing AHU all the way through so that you got the lines that indicate that going through the whole spiral, the little lines. And you're bringing in people to do counter stories, people that are on topic with you. So easy storytelling conversation events, and then ones that are a little bit more about refutation. You're doing that several times till you get enough sense that, hey, I'm getting the same information back. I'm starting to understand the nuances of context, and you got a bigger picture of what's happening.
Okay. So I'm just going to go quick because we're running out of time.
Okay, we'll skip that one.
Yeah, tell me. So what else is here? I think people can take the rest of these, or is there a lot of new?
Well, this one here is important.
Yeah.
So Charles Saunders proposed 4 tests. I'll let you read them in detail later, but try to dismiss your own precepts. In other words, your own abductions, your own theories too, and everybody else's. And ask other people. If you still need to do more research, then go around and ask other people. Have the conversational storytelling events. Invest in that as a inductive inquiry. Now, if you're still not there, maybe you need to look at science, laws of nature, and go out to other journals. Maybe your field doesn't hold the answers, and you have to go to other fields to make this an interdisciplinary dissertation. And then 4, maybe you need to do experiments yourself. Go out and become a migrant worker for a day and see how that feels. See what pay you get at the end of the day, what hassles you get, how your whole body gets gummed up with tomato glue, So what it's like to be in the heat of the sun when you can't get a glass of water, So you sort of get into the event as an experiment, or you conduct an experiment. Like, I think I know the theory. Now I'm going to do this intervention and see if we get the impact I thought it would have, experiment. So this is just a little more detailed on what Grace Ann presented, and we're throwing in a little bit more example. I put in some slides for those of you who are trying to understand how to analyze text, and you've collected your interviews, you transcribed them. What you find in conversational storytelling, very few stories. Miles of conversation transcript, you might find a little snippet here and a little snippet there, but you're an outsider. you don't see that every word is part of somebody's story and the whole entanglement of the context. So each story and each occurrence of the word story is part of the other, right? Each story is at once larger and smaller than itself, and that gets at that intersubjectivity and the contextual aspect of storytelling. So just some things to play around with. Here's an example from my 1991 article in Administrative Science Quarterly. And Doug is speaking with Sam. Doug is a new CEO. Sam has been at this organization 20 years. And I look at Goldco, that's the name of the company, as a toy that somebody decided to put in the company because it was fun. Sam says, well, I'll tell you how that came about. So here we're having a true founding story, a true storyteller coming in. I thought you would, lots of laughter from the group. And they know from that, what do you know from that? That they're all laughing as a group. That Sam's playing a role that they're all expecting Sam to play. That this is not a new event for this group. Sam Koch worked for Breeze or something like that. Oh, you know the story. You know the story? That means they've left it in your intersubjectivity to figure out. Like, I'm there, I'm an ethnographer, I'm recording this, I'm taping, I'm transcribing it myself, no secretary, I'm transcribing it. And I'm going, you know the story? Wait, I don't know this story. I don't know this story. So what have I got to do? I got to go back and talk to Sam again and find out the context. I got to talk to other people, get the history. No, go ahead, tell it. It's really important. He got out there and he came over and they formed Goldco. Goldco does not mean gold company or anything else. It means Billy Gold. Gold and Koch, Goldco, Koch. So they're explaining the derivation of it. You rarely get this kind of penetrating in depth for what's going on in conversations. You know, it's usually a bunch of et cetera, you know, kinda, and they move on.
I think, David, we need to be sure we have answered all of their questions.
All right, let's go on to the next one. This is another one. Let's
go back to their question.
All right, let's go on to the next one.
All right, so I'll just say there's some stuff here, and you're open to have another conversation. If somebody says, wait a second, I looked through that, and I had a story, and I want you to tell them more, you'll do it. Okay. And then you have some places that go.
Yeah, you can join any Monday or Tuesday. Join Grace Ann and I in the Zoom session if you want. There's our code. There's the times.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. Okay, so you might have some new people show up after next Monday. And what's this?
That's on Tuesdays. We've been doing the True Storytelling series. We started out with the basic principles of what's true, how to make room for a new story, how to have a plot in your. These are about for projects people are doing because it's more organizational. The timing of your project, how to help stories along. We did that last week. Next week we do staging. What are the artifacts to consider in staging a story? And then we'll end with reflexivity the following week. So we got 2 more weeks to go on this series.
Was that last slide that said Monday?
This is the Tuesday series.
Tuesday is storytelling. Monday is something totally different.
Sunday is storytelling using shamanic practices. You know?
That's different, David, is it not? Okay.
I know it's different. Yeah, like Monday.
Okay, so is it the same Zoom?
Zoom. Same people.
Okay. Tuesdays, there's 2 left, and there's a series.
Tuesday is more on the storytelling research, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Monday is like how to survive in the new world.
It's not on the
we don't know about yet. And then here's your shamanic drumming.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the Monday.
That's Mondays. Says
okay.
Monday.
And that's 40 out of 41. Okay, so in closing, I'll go back to the first.
Go back to the question. Let's see if we get. Did we get them all?
You got the titles of the dissertations, and you talked about what if the story tells only part of the story.
Yeah.
And you talked about the purpose of the technique. Narrative interview, you discussed the differences between narrative interview and this. Right. And you went pretty good depth into intersubjectivity analysis, and the whole idea of grounded theory and how it works, how it nestles with this. And then the others, no post talking, test whether you got what you expected. I think it was post talking or. So that was the end. I'm delighted to stay a little longer. And let me see if I can find the slides and look up the Zoom info. I'm pretty sure that those slides were also last week in the handouts, but bear with me a second. And I'm hoping some of the others of you might have comments. I'm very curious about whether you see this as being valuable for your research, and if so, what stands out for you? If you wouldn't mind sharing that. It's been a long, in-depth kind of analysis, and if we see that it will in fact have effect, then we're more likely to do other kinds of things in the future like this. But I've seen that a lot of people who've been doing a particular kind of research are now retiring and are willing to go, as David was willing to go, into the depths of all that he's learned over his years. So I'm interested in hearing your voice about that. And as you type, I will be looking for the slides that he had. So I can find the storytelling science. I think AID was what was the first thing I picked up when I was listening to him, was that AID gave me a new way of looking at my analysis, and then the anti-narrative began to make more sense. Hmm. Excellent. They yeah, they've been doing work for a long time, looking at bringing in, doing exactly what they say that we're all supposed to do, living the life, looking at it critically, always analyzing what was before and what comes next, and layering on it everything that comes up till you build a more intricate whole understanding. For those of you looking for the Zoom, the ID is 838 space 849 space 9873. But I have not found those meeting IDs to be all that useful. He calls the meeting 7 True Storytelling Principles, but he doesn't give a Zoom address. So there must be some way you can look up a Zoom by the meeting ID, or he thinks there is. You can also write Grace Ann and ask her for the meeting ID, because she'll be glad to help. And I had put her email in an earlier thread. Let's see if I can bring it back. Yep, here it is. I'll copy it and then paste it in again, if that's helpful. The time was 1 p.m. Mountain Time. 9 p.m. Central Europe. 1 p.m. Mountain Time. You can work it out from there. Good. Okay. We've run over, as I told you at the beginning we would. I appreciate your still being here. And I hope that today was very informative for you. I appreciate all of your comments in the threads and your attention to this. It's very exciting for us to do something that is kind of leading edge. So I'm stopping the recording now and saying goodbye, but if